Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. If this is your first time listening or watching our podcast, we welcome you and we hope that you return for future episodes. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, we welcome you back and we hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and insightful. And before we get to the main event, just want to make a few quick announcements. So first and foremost, we're approaching the summertime, which means that we have some new t-shirts that are going to be released through our Dane Talk apparel shop. And you can find those new designs on the Teesprings website at teesprings.com/stores/the-identity-talk-apparel-shop. And then also for any teachers who are looking for professional development as you're entering the summertime, we have our Shape of the Teacher Identity 101 virtual program, which is self-paced, which means that you can get on at your own leisure, on your own time, without any pressure. So if you are interested in learning more about certain aspects such as culturally responsive teaching, anti-racist practices, lesson planning, curriculum development, among many other things, make sure you book a call with us at calendly.com/identitytalk4 All right, y'all. So we have another episode, and today we're going to be talking about something that I believe isn't centered enough in our conversations about education. And it's this concept of anti-ableism. So we know that within our school communities, we have our special education students, whether they have 504 plans or IEP plans, who need additional accommodations, whether they are academic accommodations, physical accommodations, what have you. And with all the conversation swirling around anti-racism and what we need to do to address that, we want to try to make an effort tonight to center the importance of our students who may have disabilities in our school communities. So to help us out, I have two incredible women who are doing some phenomenal work in this area. And they're going to come on today to just talk with us about how we can integrate anti-ableist practices within our communities. So without further ado, I want to bring on the dynamic duo of the Teaching is Intellectual team, Dr. Jen Newton and Dr. Mira Cole Williams to the podcast. How are we doing, ladies?
Good. How are you?
I am doing well.
Good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're excited.
Well, thank you for coming on. I've been just waiting for this conversation because I think it's one that's important and that needs to be had on different platforms. So I'm excited to have you on. So before we get into the meat of the conversation, I want to give you an opportunity to just share a little bit about yourselves and what ultimately brought you into the education field.
All right, I'll go first. I'm Jen. I grew up in Kansas and my whole family lives there. It's the only kind of lived experience I had growing up. I went to the University of Kansas for undergrad and went straight into a master's. In my undergrad program, I did speech language hearing for my undergrad, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the clinical model. I didn't like the pull-out model. I wanted inclusion. I felt like already it wasn't okay to be pulling kids out of their general ed settings. And so I went into early childhood special ed with this idea that we could support and build environments where kids with disabilities were included, where all the other kids were. And so that was kind of my start in education. I had no intention of being a teacher, like many people who are probably listening to this podcast. But that's the direction that my path took. And then after teaching I was an early interventionist working with infants and toddlers with disabilities and their families and their homes. And then I moved into a classroom position as an inclusive pre-K teacher. And then after a few 6-7 years of doing that, I went back to the University of Kansas to get a PhD. So I've been working in higher education, doing really much more intensive teacher preparation for the last 10 years. And will probably continue to do that because I do love future teachers. So.
Awesome. We got Career Jayhawk in the house.
That's right.
All right, Mira.
All right. Yeah, I'm Mira. So I was born in California. And basically from the time I was born until I was about 8, I lived in my parents' preschool, basically, near San Francisco. So when I was 8, we moved to Charlottesville, Virginia. And like Jen was just saying, I said that I would never, ever be a teacher. I said that I would never, ever go to the University of Virginia. And I ended up doing both. So I did my undergraduate and my master's in teaching at the University of Virginia and got my master's in, at the time, it was called Early Childhood Developmental Risk, which is not a term. Jen and I talk a lot about the term risk and how we don't like it, but that was the name of the program at the time. It was a dual endorsement program, licensing in both special education and general education. So I did that. I went and I taught in an inclusive preschool classroom, and then I moved on and I taught in elementary classrooms as well, spending 3 years in kindergarten, moved kind of around between first and second as well. And then I decided to go back and get my doctorate again at the University of Virginia. And I focused in on curriculum instruction and special education with an emphasis in early childhood. And I now work at James Madison University, which is about an hour from Charlottesville. So still kind of near in Virginia. So I haven't gone too far.
Okay. All right, cool.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give some context, I am a former IEP student, so anything special ed hits near and dear to my heart. So just want to put that out there. So you all came together to start the Teaching is Intellectual platform. So I'm interested in knowing, how did the two of you meet? And then what ultimately inspired you all to start this platform, and what's its overarching mission?
That's such a good question. I'll start. We met because Mira was I was working at James Madison University at the time. My first faculty position was at JMU, and she was a doc student at UVA, where one of my doctoral colleagues from my doctoral program was faculty. And so he introduced us, actually. I hate to give him credit for anything, but he introduced us. And then when Mira was ready to look for a faculty position, we had done some presenting together and I think we even had a publication together at that time. And so I talked with her about the potential of coming to work with me at James Madison University. So that ended up happening. She came to JMU and we worked together in an inclusive early childhood special ed teacher prep program for a year. And then I did that unthinkable thing that no one should ever forgive me for. And I left Virginia and moved to St. Louis, Missouri. And so we have been friends since. And Teaching as Intellectual came out of we've worked in professional development spaces with teachers in schools for a really long time. That's part of the work of teacher educators and faculty in our role. And there were some things that kind of kept coming up and problematic practices that we were just frustrated with the fact that we couldn't sort of change the field. We couldn't move these practices forward. We weren't sure how to get at folks in a way that made it tangible and applicable enough for them to actually put into practice. And so we were on the phone one day 3 or 4 years ago, and I used to say all the time, I mean, I still say all the time, but I used to say all the time, like, teaching is intellectual work. It is more than downloading worksheets. It's more than just managing, quote unquote, managing kids. You have to understand teaching and learning. You have to have a sense of cognitive psychology. You have to think about how to gain the cooperation of your learners. It's intellectual work. And Mira had called me and we were talking about clip charts, this sort of pervasive thing in early childhood that we'd like to burn. And I said, I want to just start a website that's called Teaching is Intellectual, and just post articles and write about ways in which we need to professionalize and intellectualize teaching. And Mira was like, yeah, you should do that. And I was like, okay, well, if I'm doing it, you're doing it with me. And then we were on the phone and I was like, well, I just bought a website. And so, let's figure this out. We're going to do something with this. And a couple of friends who are in marketing and PR said, you know what you should do? You should get on Instagram. And I was like, what? Why would we get on Instagram? That's like images. We have words. And they were like, make your words into images and try it out. And so that sort of became the really steep learning curve. I don't know if you can tell from looking at us, but we are not 25-year-old teacher influencers. So learning how to negotiate that space, how to enter into it, all of the hidden rules behind, how to engage in that space. But that the overarching mission, I think, for us is to really deconstruct special education for teachers, to really challenge it, to really make teachers think about the role of special education in their equity work within their schools, and to really kind of keep putting forward some hard questions about the ways in which special education is weaponized against already marginalized kids in our schools. And that it's evolved, right? I mean, the platforms evolve, but I feel like that's pretty much where we are right now. We have always had a framing around anti-racism, and that has always been a part of our platform. I think we're getting better now at talking more about how overtly prominent ableism is, even on the platform, right? Even in lots of spaces where we're interacting with teachers, ableism is really prominent. So I think that's right now our kind of place in the bigger picture, is trying to kind of make some space for kids who are receiving services and supports, and ensuring that they have equitable opportunities as well.
Wow. So Mira, Jen called you out saying that she had a peer pressure you into doing this. So I don't know if you want to add anything to Jen's account.
Yeah, no. I mean, so I can remember I kept reading things, or like we would be having these conversations, and I just remember one day there was one particular article, and I think it was actually related to clip charts, like Jen was saying. And I sent it to Jen and I said, you wrote this. I know you wrote this. Like, this is the conversation we had last night. And it was that same thing that she just described, right? We were like, why are we not, right? Why we have all these conversations, we have them with each other, we're having them with our students that have graduated. We stay in touch with a lot of our students that graduate, and they're in the classrooms, and they're, trying to get feedback from us and texting us and calling us. And we just thought, why are we not doing this? And I definitely was more along the lines of like, Jen, why are you not doing this? And she did say, well, you're going to do it with me. But she definitely does a lot more of the day-to-day work than I do. And she doesn't like to give herself enough credit for that, but I will.
Well, that's her being a great teammate. Humility is an important trait for all of us to have, especially as teachers.
And I think there's something about having thought partners that's really, I wouldn't put myself out there if I didn't know she had my back. And I do workshop a lot of things before I put them out there. It's things we talk about. But I also have that moment sometimes where I'm like, I should let her know what I just did in the event that, you know, it somehow comes back to her, because she's also, her name is on it. So I try to loop her in.
No, it's all good.
Awesome. So y'all mentioned the term ableism. So this podcast is an educational podcast. So we try to break down and simplify these fancy terms into layman's terms so that our audience, who may not all be educators, can understand what's going on. So could you define to us what ableism is? And then also, how does it intertwine with white supremacist culture that exists within so many of our K-12 school communities?
Well, I can define it. And then Jen, you want to talk a little bit more about how it intertwines?
Sure.
So when we were talking, we came up with I think it's a pretty solid definition, because you're right. It's something that can get confusing for people, but it's really the belief, right, that people with disabilities are inherently inferior, or that people with disabilities need to be, quote unquote, fixed, right? Rather than thinking about what we as a society, what we need to do to remove barriers and to provide accommodations.
And the way that ableism shows up in our K-12 environments is around segregated classrooms, the overrepresentation of Black and brown kids in these systems, right? So we know that special education has been weaponized against Black and brown children because it's a way of separating students who don't necessarily fit the norm or fit the expectation of the broader school community, then are moved into this separate tract. Access to the general education curriculum is often not available for a lot of students. They are not given access. There's not high expectations for their participation in their own education. And those low expectations then feed into low graduation rates, lower post-graduation outcomes, less likely to go to college, less likely to earn a living wage, right? So all of those things are factors in the way that we uphold white supremacy in schools by ensuring that certain people will be successful and get the supports that they need, and then certain people will be tracked out of those opportunities. So ableism is definitely a part of and needs to be a part of all of our equity work in schools.
And to continue on that track, we have this national conversation going on around critical race theory. A lot of pundits and people on the political right are in total opposition against it, even though many of them don't even know what it is. But that's another story for another day. So what I want to know is, how does ableism factor into that national conversation, and really in what ways can we view ableism through the lens of critical race theory?
That's a good question, and I think an important one I wish that we were having a lot more of. So critical race theory as a theory versus the way it's being framed in the media, right? So if we think about the way it's being framed in the media, it's the idea that whitewashing should persist. We should only tell kids the good stuff. We should only tell them the fairy tales. We should only tell them the happy stories of the Thanksgiving dinner where all of the white people and all of the tribal communities came together and they broke bread, right? And that those are the stories that we should be perpetuating. In those stories, no one's disabled, right? And if they are, they're the inspirational disabled person who overcomes their disability. Versus what we know to be true is that critical race theory is a way of helping us to understand the factors that influence our society and the ways in which race influence the way that our society is structured. And theory is just a way of looking at the world. It's just a framework, right? It's not even nobody teaches critical race theory in schools. That you have to seek out a graduate level course to really learn about critical race theory. What they're protesting is telling kids the truth. and really dissecting the realities of the systems that we work and live in. And ableism is another factor in that. So to me, the way that they're kind of intertwined is this idea that segregated systems like special education and general education are just the way it is. And it's really okay and happy and everyone's getting what they need. And we're all good with that. Refusing to kind of look at the data and to say, okay, there are actually overrepresentation issues. There are underrepresentation issues. There are way too many Black and brown boys are served in emotional disturbances and disabilities categories, and way too few of them are getting supports for learning disabilities that they actually need. Right. So this is a way that the things that we're sort of hearing these really bizarre arguments about play out in our schools is this idea that, well, of course, kids with special needs need to be in a separate system, need to be in this other place where they're getting more supports. And then when we come in and we ask questions like, what does more supports look like? What's special about wanting access to an education? How is that a special need? Right. So I think it's a matter of, we have to be honest about the fact that they're willfully misrepresenting CRT. It's intentional to, lead us astray so that we're having an argument about something over here instead of talking about what's happening right here. But I definitely think that the way that it plays out in our school systems is this belief that special education and general education, that students are either special education students or general education students, and it's okay for us to label them and sort them in that way.
Awesome. Mira, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with what Jen said. And I think we hear about this daily from our students that are in classrooms right now. The last thing that Jen just said about trying, like we push our students, right? We talk all about inclusion, and then they get into school systems and they're like, wait a second, but that's not what's happening. And it's because of what Jen just said, right? We're trying to intentionally sort and slot students. And it's really problematic.
It is. And I actually have a story that I want to share with you all. And I want to get your thoughts on this, because when I was a teacher in Massachusetts, I'm still a licensed teacher in moderate disabilities. So I taught in the city of Boston for 5 years. And during my tenure, the district was pushing for gen ed teachers to obtain an additional certification, whether it was in ESL, whether it was in SPED, or moderate or severe disabilities. So what they said was, if you didn't get your additional certification by a certain time period, you would end up not having a job within your school. So I ended up going through a summer program, an accelerated program, where pretty much I spent 5 weeks, preparing for a certification test on moderate disabilities. And I passed it, and I was able to get that additional cert. But here's the flip side to all that. What you saw happening was you had these gen ed teachers like myself who had these certifications now having students inclusion classrooms with IEP students. I was in a school that had a very prominent autism population. So I had some autism students. I also had non-IEP students who probably should have been on IEP and needed some support there. But I'm not an expert. I just passed a test. And I have all these kids in my classroom, and I have to figure out a way to differentiate my instruction, to differentiate the different tasks that I was assigning to them, and all these other responsibilities. So I don't know if that's happened in Virginia or even in Ohio or just places where you've been, but I just want to get your thoughts on just how certain districts try to go the cost-effective route of not hiring certified SPED teachers, but rather forcing gen ed teachers to get additional certifications?
Yeah, I think you're making a really great and important point, and I think that it also pulls from the bigger kind of misconception that IDEA, the law that special education mandates that kids with disabilities are served in schools, indicates that students should have access to the gen ed curriculum first, and that they should be in general ed settings to the maximum extent possible. So if we're going to pull them out of that setting, we need to justify it. It should be written into the IEP why they're not with their non-disabled peers. A lot of times, the misconception is that inclusion means putting all the kids, like in your situation, that's not inclusion, right?
Right.
Putting all those kids in the same class and being like, okay, well, you have 2 certifications, so you should be able to manage this, is not services and supports. We talk a lot about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So that situation may have met the letter of the law in terms of you being a licensed intervention specialist and being in that room, but it does not meet the spirit of the law, which is that individualized and specially designed instruction has to be provided to every student who is served under special education. So that's a workaround that, I will say this too. You're right. It is absolutely a cost-effective way of just, getting as few teachers, as many students as possible. Also, administrators in the vast majority of administrative prep programs in this country do not take any special education coursework. Not one course on the law or their responsibility toward upholding it or being accountable for it. And so a big part of our job is to really get in there with ed admin at the program side and at the professional development side and make them aware of the ableism that's rampant in the system, the ways in which they're upholding it, and give them some other strategies for supporting students. So that is, I think we've seen that everywhere. And what's happening now in a lot of the vast majority of states is that teachers have to have multiple licenses in a variety of different areas because that, principals and superintendents want to be able to move you wherever, whenever they need to. So they really want this broad stance. Well, the more you broaden people's expertise, the more you're diminishing the intellectual capacity of their work, right? You can't be, like in special education, it's a K-12 license. You cannot be an intervention specialist who's an expert on K-12 intervention. You can't. Not in 4 years, maybe in 40 years, but it's not a reasonable expectation.
Well said. Well said. And I've had a lot of colleagues who are triple certified, and they were under this same pressure to perform because of their triple certified status, which was just totally unfair.
Yeah.
Totally unfair. So with regard to that, we talked about how ableism manifests itself within our K-12 school communities. So what I want to know is, and I think, Jen, you were starting to talk about this, in what ways can we get educators and school districts to integrate anti-ableist practices so that we can minimize and eliminate the ableism that does exist within those communities?
I love that question.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you think, Mira. I'll start with this. I think one thing that is really important is beginning with our language. I think we need to constantly and consistently remind each other and ourselves that all kids are gen ed kids first. So we're not saying things like the special ed students, the IEP students. That is deeply ableist framing, and it is separating kids, right, by our language. IEPs are documentation of services and supports. That's it. It's a legal document that says we will provide these additional supports in order for a student to access the general education curriculum. And it's not a separate curriculum. It's not a separate track. It's just services and supports in the gen ed space. So we need to change our language and get really intentional about the way that we talk about students, and ensuring that we're using strengths-based language so that students are getting the best version of themselves as well, right? We teach ableism through our bifurcated system. We're teaching students that there are certain students that don't belong in our community, and they learn that from a very young age. So the more that we segregate, the more we reinforce ableism. So another thing I would say is that we have to continuously strive to find opportunities for engagement socially and meaningfully across our programming, so that students have a sense, students with disabilities and students without disabilities have a sense of belonging within their school community. And that means that teachers have to unlearn their ableism too, right? They have to be able to see that there's value in each one of the students in their school. They have to be able to look at a student who potentially demonstrates behaviors they don't like, or who lots of other teachers talk bad about and go, oh, he runs away all the time, or he's constantly screaming or whatever, and really see value in that student and invest in getting to know them so that they have some sense of connection with them. Because generally speaking, students who elope a lot aren't feeling safe, right? They're not feeling like their needs are getting met. And so we have to change the way we talk and think about it and about students, and the way that we're persisting in that ableism with our own students. Because when we're teaching them what to think about kids who learn certain ways or act certain ways. And for most of us who grew up in segregated school settings, unlearning ableism and really getting comfortable with people with disabilities, and really getting comfortable talking about people with disabilities, talking with people with disabilities, that takes work, because we haven't been exposed to a lot of disabled people. And that's by design, right? They're intentionally segregated from us. So think about that, the power of being intentionally segregated and what that teaches us. So I think there's a couple of things there. What would you add, Mir?
I would say the conversation of reminding everybody that special education is not a place, right? Like Jen mentioned, it's supports and services. It's not a place. And this is something that we are constantly stressing because it's often thought of as a place. It's often in a school referred to as a place you go, right? A place you send. I've seen it with my own child, in fact. And then I would say the second thing is we have to also be really intentional about the way that we view success for kids. I think a lot of times what I see happening in classrooms is we see a child make some growth, and then all of a sudden we assume that they don't need accommodations and they don't need supports. And I think that can actually perpetuate even more stereotypes for students and for also their peers. So I think we just have to be really cautious about those kinds of things.
And troubling the notion that supports are a bad thing.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, I think that's a really important thing, is that we all need supports in different ways. And we've decided socially as a construct that some supports are acceptable and some aren't. And that social construct also often is predicated on your proximity to normal or typical in terms of development. So we notice that, we see that a lot, this withholding of accommodations to kind of be like, oh, can you do it now? Right. So we have to think about what, I love that. I love what you just said about redefining success, right? If we really want to be inclusive, we cannot continue to measure success one way, by your grade, by your test score. We cannot do that. We have got to let lots of ways of knowing and doing and being shine.
Yep.
And then just to add on what you're saying, as someone who was an IEP student, you also have to affirm the compensatory learning strategies that students possess in order to access content, in order to thrive in the classroom. So that's something that I think we need to factor in as well.
Yeah, and I think this idea too of really asking kids what they need in order to learn or show what they know. Because oftentimes kids have worked out strategies on their own, right? They have figured out workarounds. They have decided some supports that work for them, and they hide them from us because they think they're not sufficient or not appropriate or whatever. So asking kids to participate is really important.
But then why do they feel that they're not sufficient? Where does that stem from? This conditioning.
Yep, exactly. And that's on us, right? That's something for us to reflect on, is like, what are we doing that we're kind of teaching them that?
Right. So I'm going to assume that you and Mira, you're not fans of tracking.
Nope.
And you're definitely not fans of teachers who lower the academic rigor of an assignment in order for students to access, because of this perceived notion that they're not able to handle the rigor at the level of the other students in the classroom.
Yeah, and we should trouble the notion of rigor, right?
Yes.
Right. So there's also the idea that if the assignment looks one way, and then I kind of reduce it based on showing me what I asked for and the way I asked for it. Whereas if you gave students some freedom around how they report out what they know, you might be surprised. It has been my experience, and in interacting and talking with a lot of disabled people, there just is so much value in engaging people in their own learning, right? And so really letting them be participants and not just receivers, like just sort of the empty vessel kind of idea. But if we really went with the pedagogy of the oppressed, and we really thought about what does it mean to, not trust this banking model, but to really invest in and pour into each other and trust each other. And that is really the best model for kids with disabilities. I mean, every kid. That's the thing about inclusive practices, is that if you're really teaching broadly for everyone to have access, and you're teaching in a universally designed way, everybody in your class is going to benefit.
Absolutely, for sure. And for those who aren't familiar with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you need to study Paulo Freire's work. It is a book that every person should have if you're an educator.
Agreed.
You need to have that book.
I agree.
So just want to throw that out there, because we're all about educating our audience. So we're in this pandemic right now where virtual learning is taking over. And it's caused some difficulties for a lot of us, teachers, parents, and even students. But what I want to know is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted teachers' abilities to support their special education students who are in need of high intervention? Because I know pre-pandemic, that was something that we weren't doing proficiently in a general sense.
Yeah.
But now the pandemic has really exacerbated this issue. So, I mean, how do we ensure that students are in that least restrictive environment so they can thrive? Like, what does that look like now?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. It's definitely different depending, on where regionally people are, and it's different systems have made different decisions about this. I do think for the most part, kids with disabilities re-entered schools primarily like early on. So there were opportunities for special ed teachers and kids with disabilities to come in pods, to be in person, because the parenting part of it is just an unsustainable, untenable burden when families are working. They don't have respite care. They don't have home support. They cannot just be supporting their learner all day online. And the Zoom fatigue hits kids with sensory needs and other disabilities a lot harder. So I think that it was pretty evident early on that we were going to have to get really creative in meeting the needs of students and their families. The federal government did do some early sort of waiving of expectations for data collection and reporting out on progress. And not that I think is the best thing, but it did give teachers a little bit of time to try to figure out how this could work and meet with families individually. I think the biggest thing, and you alluded to this when you asked this question, the biggest thing is that the system is not built for these kids, their families, or their teachers. And so there were tons of resources out there for supporting teachers in moving online, and there just was nothing for kids for teachers who support kids with low incidence disabilities or the highest support needs. So that, I think, was a major, there were things we found out, those inequities that we knew existed that just weren't in the public eye, like broadband and Wi-Fi. And then this was another thing that we already knew about, but it became really evident when this happened. So, and this districts are super ableist too, right? They're like, this population of students are a real burden on our system. We don't know what we're going to do with them and how we're going to support them with all of this other stuff going on. So I think that was one kind of thing. I think another thing that happened as a result was this hyper focus on compliance with IEP minutes. So in order to, some schools are really hyper focused on minutes. That's like their only measure of how they're meeting kids' needs and goals. But that got a lot worse when we moved online. It was like, well, kids have to be on Zoom for X amount of minutes. And because we have to document that intervention time, as though us being on Zoom means that I'm getting the supports that I need, right? Mira, what else would you say? Oh, do you want to talk about summer school?
Yeah. Well, I think right now, so I've been talking to a bunch of teachers that are out in the field right now, and their years are winding down, and there's this push to catch up, right? Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to, again, thinking about using the word fix, right? And the idea is that we put the majority of students that are receiving some kind of special education services into extended school year or summer school. And teachers are burnt out, they're spent, and they're like, I'm not going to teach, right? I need my summer. I've had a year of just nonstop. So then here we are, right? We're saying all of these students need summer school, or some districts are even saying they have to. It's not an option, it's a requirement. They need to be in summer school in order to get their minutes or whatever it might be. And there's nobody to teach it.
And to add on to what the two of you are saying, I also think that part of the reason why there's such a strict requirement on IEP minutes is the fact that many teachers are evaluated based on their performance. And part of that criteria is how they are performing, within those minutes.
Yeah.
So I think that
as though our performance can be measured in minutes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
well, and I think that some of the things that were done earlier, like what you were saying, Jen, about like the waivers and things like that, I think some of that is now backfiring, right? Because it's super problematic now because they're realizing, oh, wait, we can't waive, right? We can no longer have waivers. So what are we going to do? Now we're going to make all of these students have to take all of these things all together, all at once. And everybody's just kind of spinning in circles.
Yeah. I mean, when we think about how alternative assessments and testing accommodations were provided for end of year testing that, shouldn't have happened. And we have a total shortage, and normally when we have testing season, we have kids who have lots of accommodations for tests. We bring in the bus drivers to do read alouds of test questions. We have, some of our janitorial and custodial staff supporting kids doing read alouds. Like, it's every warm body that we can find to help provide those accommodations. And to do that now, given all of the other kind of complexities around testing this semester, it was just incredibly hard and then just the stress of knowing that the students likely aren't prepared, right? And then the frustration of not doing well, and it's just really hard. But those waivers, I think you're right. I think they did end up being not worth their weight.
Right. So we've talked about how the pandemic has impacted K-12 students, particularly our SPED students. But I'm also wondering, as professors who are training teacher candidates, specifically special education teacher candidates, to enter the classroom, how has the pandemic impacted the way in which you train those teacher candidates for the classroom? Because the reality is this is going to be what it is for the foreseeable future. Like, we're going to be doing virtual learning for a while. We're not going to get back to this normal of being in the brick and mortar of a classroom. So how is that in any way, if it has altered the way that you go about your work and training those teachers?
In every way. And I think one of the things, I'll let Mira to answer. I think one of the biggest things is that every teacher has been scrambling, right? Every teacher has been holding on by a thread, really just trying to like keep ahead one day. And to take on, normally in typical times, our students are still going to be a burden on any classroom teacher. It's additional work, right? It is additional work to host a student. But normally the students can contribute in some ways that there is a bit of a trade-off in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, that our candidates can help in certain ways. That is not true in a virtual setting, at least in this past year. So while teachers are scrambling to kind of keep up with the kind of constant changing expectations of their day job, many of our administrators just weren't willing to ask them to also take on a student. So I have a K-12 4-year program, and my juniors typically spend a whole year in a year-long placement. So they're with one teacher in one classroom for the whole year, and almost none of them had a teacher their whole junior year. They didn't even have a teacher. So their field and methods classes were really rooted in like the National Board Certification website's Atlas, which is where they keep a library of videos of nationally board certified teachers that we could access, but they really didn't have. So while you're saying, learning how to teach online, learning how to teach virtually, they weren't really having those experiences because it's incredibly hard to put that additional burden on teachers while they're managing their own jobs right now. The interns, which is what we call student teachers, the interns did have placements, and most of them were virtual. So the interns were able to have at least a teacher that they were connected with in an actual class, a group of learners, but that was pretty rare for us. Mira had a different experience, but I wonder, and I think a lot about the long-term impact on now 2 cohorts of mine, graduates, who will be missing hundreds of hours of field experience that they would have otherwise had in their undergrad. Mira, what about you?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked this because I was just reading my course evaluations earlier about some of these changes and switches, and students are all over the place in terms of understanding, but a lot of them didn't understand the burden that teachers would have had to do. And I was reading comments kind of like, we should have been able to Zoom into classrooms, but then who's going to walk around with an iPad or a computer, right? As they follow preschoolers around, So, and I'm not upset with my students for any of those comments. I think they want to be in classrooms. But spring semester, a lot more things opened up for us in our area. And I had students in all different kinds of situations. I had some students that were face-to-face in classrooms with masks, socially distanced, lots of extra cleaning. I had some students that were all online. I had some students that were in some type of hybrid type of setup. And then I had some students that they actually started online and then kind of, I guess, a little bit more than midway through switched and just went into the classroom, and they were having to experience what it was like to welcome students back after being out of school for over a year, and just what does that even look like and what does that mean? So I don't know. I mean, I think to go back to your original question in terms of how our preparation has like changed. It's changed a ton. I think one of the things that I consistently try to do is help students recognize that they are actually gaining a lot from these experiences they're having. Getting them to reflect on all kinds of things that they're in these students' homes. Sometimes parents are joining in on the Zoom calls. Sometimes things are set in the background and they don't know how to handle it. So I'm trying to remind them and get them to recognize and realize that they're also gaining a lot of new tools that will be super useful for their future. But it's a process.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. And I know pre-pandemic we were saying this, but there's just no way that you can standardize the way that you assess teacher performance under this current setting. There's no way you can standardize that.
Nor should we be trying.
No, not at all. We shouldn't be. Not at all.
No.
Right.
There's nothing standard about this experience, right? I mean, when we go into a school or we go into a workplace, there is a certain amount of standardization because we're in the same environment. We all have the same kind of materials, generally speaking, to do our job. We don't have any of that anymore. When people are at home putting together seesaw lessons, you have what you have, right? I mean, my table here is set up with board games on a second monitor I took from my office. My lamp is held up by 6 of my kids' books. We're all just making it work. So the idea that you would want to make this harder on anybody, I think everybody really is doing their hardest.
And that's all you can do in that situation. So I have one more question before we get to the lightning round. And I know earlier in the conversation, you talked about how you've been very much vocal about the need for anti-racist practices within school communities. So what I would like to know from you all is, how have you used your positionality as white women to be active co-conspirators for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color within those school communities?
I think for me, it's just never stopping, right? Like never taking a moment to say, oh, I'm going to sit out on this one, or I'm not going to say anything to that comment. And it's taken me a while to get there. My kids are biracial. They identify as Black. And I've had to do a lot of pushing back and standing back for my own, especially my oldest daughter. But I haven't always felt comfortable in my work position to do the same. Like that mama, like you're not gonna do that to my child. Right. Comes out super easily for me, but I had to do a lot of work for it to come out in my own job. So I think that's something that I've learned to do, and I'm doing a lot of work on it, and I'm speaking up in meetings, and I'm stopping people if I hear something in the hallway, and I'm having these conversations with our students. One thing Jen and I talk a lot about is that we primarily prepare white females. So we need to use our position as white females to help them recognize their biases, to help them recognize what they can do, right? To be also co-conspirators.
Yeah, I think too, when I think about our positionality, we're positioned as white women, right? We're also positioned as women in higher ed, women in academia.
Yep.
And we have a role and a responsibility there as carriers of that positionality. And And as teachers, I mean, that's one of the beauties, I think, of our partnership is that we both really see ourselves as learners, and we're always learning. So the way I teach a class this semester is so different than the way I taught the same class last semester, because I learned a lot of things, right? And I learned about myself, and I have this memory of talking about and reading a little bit of Milner around the way that race factors into discipline decisions with my students. And then I realized in our conversation that we hadn't even begun talking about how whiteness shows up and what white supremacy culture looks like and what white culture looks like. Because many students are like, you know, when I ask white students what your culture is, they're like, I don't have one. Like we don't have a culture. So learning that I have to really start with that and really helping them to understand their own positionality. And I do that by understanding my own and constantly reflecting on that, the role that I have to be a outspoken, visibly, verbally, physically anti-racist white woman in those spaces. It can't just be that I say these things when it comes up, right? I have to always be positioning it so that they're getting that modeling. And I think that we teach, no matter what content, the way that Mira and I's careers have unfolded, we teach a lot of classes, a lot of different classes. We're not like the cool academics that always teach the same section year after year. But every course, no matter what it is rooted in racism and the role of white supremacy in the work that we do. And once you kind of establish that positioning for the students, then everything else can kind of sit on top of it. But we have to understand that what we think about as best practices in education are often rooted in a system of white supremacy. What we think about as special education are rooted in a system of white supremacy. So really helping them to sort of unpack their own experiences as students and reflect more critically on the system has to be a part of our prep. Now, I don't think that's happening, you know, universally by any means, but it is something that we're getting better at. And Mira does a lot of work in her department and in her college in engaging the broader college in these anti-racist conversations. And of course that's challenging, right? We're seeing more and more students with disabilities coming into our programs. Higher education has never been a place that was particularly nimble or accessible for people with disabilities. So we're finding all kinds of new barriers that we didn't know about as we try to figure out ways to help our students navigate those systems and be successful. So, you know, it's constant learning and constant like being ready to fight the fight. And I do think, you know, like I said earlier, you know, we're not early 20s teachers, but there is some benefit to being late 30s, early 40s teachers, because we have gained some experiences and some wounds along the way, and we have more fight in us now, I think.
Well said, especially that late 30s, early 40s comment. You know, I'm in that group as well, so definitely take a lot of pride in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and get into the lightning round? So with the lightning round, we just have some quick hitter questions to close us out. And the first question I want to ask is, what is your favorite activity, especially now?
Mine is hiking. I live in the woods, so I like to get outside.
Nice.
Mine is bar class, and I just started journaling with my cup of coffee.
There you go. A book that you're currently reading right now, and it doesn't have to be education based. It could be a book you're reading for leisure. So
leisure? What is this word you say? I am actually currently reading Alex Bennett at Unconditional Learning on Instagram's new equity-centered, trauma-focused book. I just got it, so I'm reading that right now.
Awesome.
And I'm rereading We Want to Do More Than Survive by Bettina Loves for, well, one, because I like to read it, but two, because I'm also going to be teaching it again this fall.
And that's an awesome book. So if you all can invite 4 figures to dinner, influential figures dead or alive, who would they be? So what we'll do is each of you will just give 2 people just for the sake of equity.
Man, we poured over this. All right, let me pick my favorite 2. So since we're talking a lot about ableism, I'm going to pick Brad Lomax, who was a Black Panther who participated and supported the work of the disability rights sit-in, and I think is an underrepresented and super fascinating person. So I would want that to be him. And then there's a guy named Robert Evans who does a podcast called Behind the Bastards. I don't know if you've heard that, but it's all about like the story behind all of the worst people in history. And I would like to have dinner with him. So Robert Evans and Brad Lomax for me.
I'm going to say Stacey Abrams, and then I'm going to say actually one of Jen's former students, Jordan, because we were actually just talking about how much I need to meet her and sit down and have dinner with her.
And Jordan would be another, we should then, I think we should also think about her for a guest spot on your podcast, Kwame.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, you took that question. There you go, psychic or something? All right. I actually have one more question, and this is a fun one. So if each of you walked into your classroom, right, what would be your walk-in song?
Oh gosh.
That is, man, we were prepped for everything else.
My walk-in song.
This is a hot topic in my house. There's a lot of conversation over big walk-in songs. But I kind of want to have like a walk-in song when I finally get to go back to my class.
Yeah, now I really need a walk-in song.
Yeah.
All right, there you go.
But
wait, what's yours?
My mind is not one that should, but it was from a graduation party this weekend. When you said walk-in song, I thought of Who Let the Dogs Out, because that's exactly what they played at my friend's son's graduation. And I was thinking,
really?
What in the world? Yes. Because that should not be my walk-in song, I don't think.
Kwame, what's yours? What's your walk-in song?
My walk-in song is called You Must Learn. So this is so I'm not familiar with Boogie Down Productions, KRS-One, the rapper.
Mm-hmm.
So You Must Learn is a song that talks about the need to integrate African-American history in K-12 schools. So this is a song that came out in the late 80s. But I will say You Must Learn because in order for us to engage in anti-racist work, in order for us to be the best teachers possible, and you alluded to this earlier in the conversation, we always have to be perpetual learners. Like, we can't just get stagnant in our learning and in our development. We have to continue to learn and continue to build our capacity in areas where we may not be as proficient or as knowledgeable. So You Must Learn. That's my song.
I love that. I'm gonna look that up. My kid just texted me and said mine would be Raise Your Glass by Pink. I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm gonna take it.
All right. Why not? Why not?
I don't know if that's a compliment.
I don't even know the song, so I can't really make judgment as to whether it's a good choice or not. I have to listen to it myself. I know Pink, but I don't know that song.
You'll know it when you hear it. You'll know it.
Okay. That's fair enough.
Did you come up with anything, Mira? How about Uptown Funk for you?
I love Bruno Mars, so. Yeah, Bruno's the best. All right. But this has been awesome. Jen and Mira, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We need to have more conversations around anti-ableism, and we need to center our students who who are in special education, because for whatever reason, they always tend to be overlooked or just an afterthought when we have these conversations around education. So thank you for engaging me in this conversation and for educating me too, because I learned a few new things today.
Thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
Yes. And before you all go, let people know how they can connect with you on social media, and also share your website and anything else that's, coming up for you all.
Awesome. Everything is Teaching is Intellectual. So at Teaching is Intellectual on Instagram and on Facebook. And then we have a website, teachingisintellectual.com. We haven't written there for quite some time, but we do post articles there that might be of interest. There's articles on ableism, racism in schools, some professional development that Mira and I have done. So there's lots of different things that you can hang out and check out there that might be good resources for you. So
awesome. And if you are a doctoral student or anybody who's trying to get a lit review put together, definitely visit the website, because they have some great publications in there and some articles that you can use for reference purposes. So definitely make sure you check out Jen and Mira's website at Teaching is Intellectual. Well, ladies, thank you so much. And we will continue to engage in this work together.
thank you.
All right. You have a good rest of the day.
You too.
All right. All right. So we have just ended another fantastic and informative episode of I Didn't Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all a good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.